So making sense of prophets and prophecy. That's the thing for the evening. And here's a sort of plan of what we're likely to be up to. Bit on why preach and why preach on the Old Testament, and then something on prophets and prophecy. And then some stuff about suggestions for preachers. And then after break, we'll try it with a text. I'll give you 3 texts to choose, and in small groups, a quarter of an hour, and then bring that together again and see what you made of that. I've got a few images, as you may see there. There's Elijah. When you go looking for images of biblical prophets, Elijah comes up a lot. He gets an awful lot of interest in all down the centuries. So you'll find Elijah features perhaps unrepresentatively large amount of Elijah in this session. So just a bit of thinking first about why preach on the Old Testament. First of all, why preach? That might seem a bit of an unexpected one. We might feel we already know the answer to that one. We may feel we're already committed as preachers, but it's worth just asking why preach. Is it worth it? Sometimes we can wonder that, and sometimes the world around us wonders, is preaching really a worthwhile project? Is it worth continuing with, or is it old and out of date? Let me give you a quotation. I was reviewing a book by Walter Brueggemann, who's really one of the sort of most significant Old Testament scholar figures of recent times, particularly in North America, but also throughout the Old Testament sort of world of study. And Brueggemann describes, he says, I've always worked to maintain credible membership of the Academic Guild of Old Testament Studies. He's certainly done that. But he said, I was able to see that my proper work, interesting phrase, my proper work was in and for the church. More specifically, the most important constituency for my research and writing have been the pastors of the church. And then he goes on to say this. He talks about himself becoming freshly aware of how pivotal good preaching is for the experience and mobilization of a missional congregation. What still counts in the local congregation is truth-telling about the pain of the world, and then hope-telling that evokes passionate investment. I really like that last sentence. It's to me, that's classic Walter Brueggemann, because it's simultaneously beautifully clear and also puzzlingly opaque, both at the same time. The opaque bit is that last phrase, evokes passionate investment. I think what he means by that is that preaching isn't just entertainment or vaguely interesting. Preaching is designed to produce a response, a passionate response that invests ourselves in the message and in the good news. And because of his sort of coyness and who he wants to evoke, I think it's not just the congregation. I think maybe he's thinking there of the preacher as well, that when we preach, it should stir us and prompt us to change and to live differently, as well as hopefully prompting the congregation. So that's the sort of the opaque, fuzzy bit. But then the very clear bit, preaching is about truth-telling about the pain of the world, and hope-telling alongside it, hope-telling that evokes passionate investment. And currently that's my favorite sort of definition of preaching. I just find that very powerful. Truth-telling about the pain of the world. If we don't do that, we get sort of superficial or irrelevant and don't touch people's lives. But if all we do is that, then we may leave people in despair and struggle. So along with the truth telling about the pain of the world, hope telling. There is hope, there is good news, there is a message we want to share. And that's the message that evokes passionate investment, that gets people to engage and to live differently. So something on the value of preaching. What about preaching? Why preach on the Old Testament? That's an interesting question. Maybe I'll actually stop the screen share there if I can, and we could just have a bit of conversation about that. Why preach on the Old Testament? Do you ever preach on the Old Testament? Do you ever hear the Old Testament in your churches? Just give us a bit of conversation. I mean, how many of us hear the Old Testament regularly in our churches? Maybe just wave a hand at the screen. Okay, so it's a fair number, but not all. I think in many churches, if the main service is Eucharistic, there will obviously be the gospel, and then there will also be another reading, which might well be a New Testament letter rather than the Old Testament. Why preach on the Old Testament? Anyone just want to give us a reaction to that? Why do it? Just give us a wave, and yeah, Malcolm, yeah, you've got to.
Because the Old Testament lesson in the Revised Lectionary is often the background of the gospel for the day. So the two go together.
Yeah.
And people can be reminded of our Jewish inheritance.
Yeah, so it may well link to the gospel. Particularly, there's two different offerings after Pentecost. There's the continuous or the related in the lectionary, and if you're going with the related one, that particularly tries to link with the gospel. But even if it doesn't intentionally link, the Old Testament is the whole kind of operating system of Jewish thought and of Jesus and his followers. So it's very much there and embedded. I sometimes think it's a bit like if you had a Word file on your computer, you tried to open it without first installing Windows. Windows is the operating system that then enables you to open up the Word file, and you really need the two to achieve that. Somebody else, any other thoughts on why preach on the Old Testament? Catherine Birchall, I can see. Yeah.
I find the Old Testament far more interesting than the New Testament.
Tell us about interesting.
The epistles leave me cold. Whereas I love the poetry of the prophets. I like the stories in the Old Testament. I like you find some very kind of interesting and difficult characters in the Old Testament, and yes. I like grappling with all that.
Yes, interesting and difficult characters. Yes, that's quite a nice way of putting it. It's very vivid. There's a lot of narrative and a lot of characters we meet there. Very colourful. Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? One more? Any other comment on why? I can't see you all on my screen, so you might want to raise a digital hand if you want to get my attention. As there's too many of you to be on a visual screen. Anybody else on why? Sally Wood's waving at me. Hello, Sally. You need to
just
unmute
to say that I think she's underneath John Hosker. She's got John Hosker's name at her, but I think that's not John. I think it's somebody else, and she was waving frantically to speak.
So you're waving on behalf of somebody else, well, she may be under John in your screen,
it's
but
Jenny, it's me. I haven't
Okay.
managed to change my name on my computer to John. I mean, the New Testament, every bit of it is so full of references, allusions to the Old Testament. I mean, it's hard to see how you could really properly understand the New Testament and give all its richness and offering without understanding the Old Testament.
Yep.
I mean, sorry, Bill, I thought calling it an operational manual, it was a very good image, but it was a bit dry.
Yes.
Given the richness and beauty of the Old Testament, on which, I mean, they crafted so much of their writing to refer to that Old Testament, the Hebrew scripture. So you're missing a whole way in which they've crafted what they wrote.
Yep. Yep, and it's Jesus's scriptures as well, and it shaped his thinking, and the early church's scriptures, Paul's thinking, all of them are shaped by it. And yes, it is some wonderfully rich stuff, as you say. An operating system is a rather technical metaphor. I mean, it's also 80% of our Bible. It's a rather large chunk. If people are never exposed to it, to experience it, then they're actually missing something. And it's this whole story of God's people, God's work in the world and with a particular people and through those people, which then rolls on into the New Testament. But this is the backstory, if you like, the prequel that leads up to the New Testament. I think some of us, when preaching, wonder if we should only preach on the gospel to keep the focus on Christ. I don't know if anybody wants to speak on that. Do we need to make the majority or part of the sermon particularly focused on Jesus, or not? Can we preach simply on the Old Testament? Anyone got any thoughts on that? John Hoskers. There's two Johns. So this is Jenny. This is Jenny John.
Yeah, is it me? Sorry, yep. Sorry, Bill. The question. Sorry, pardon me. The question. Just repeat the question, please.
Do we need to preach on the gospel? Do we need to focus particularly on Jesus in the sermon, or can we have a sermon that's simply on an Old Testament passage?
Well, we were taught at the School of Ministry you always should centre your sermon on Jesus. And I don't like just harvesting the Old Testament for references to Jesus, but actually we do see Jesus as a fulfillment of all those promises and all that history. So anything on the Old Testament will always lead you to Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, it all leads and follows on to Christ. What about Sarah? What's your thoughts, Sarah Morn?
I was just thinking about I tend to really reflect on it during the week, to be honest, Bill, as to where I feel the most voice is needed in this place. So I use the lectionary, so I don't have to. We get the redemption sheet, so I know a good while in advance. And I tend to ponder on it quite a lot and read all of the passages that we've been offered for the day, for the upcoming week, on quite a few occasions. And I let the Spirit lead me actually as much as I can when I'm listening, when I can hear, because it depends on the very place that you're at within yourself and in your context.
Yeah. And also where the church is at and what the particular things are going on in the community and the congregation. There might be something in one of the readings that chimes in with.
Of course, and I might use both.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure there's any clear right or wrong on this. When I'm out and about preaching, I often do choose the Old Testament, either the Old Testament reading or Psalm for the day. And that's partly because I love this territory. And also because I have a sense that people don't hear much of this, and I want them to hear it. And I may well bring it round to Christ towards the end, but not always very much. And one thing I'm aware of is that actually the service doesn't have to be all about the sermon, particularly if it's Eucharistic. Then the end of the service will bring us round very strongly to Christ and all that he's done, all he means to us. And there are other parts of the service. There's songs, there's silences, there might be testimony. So the whole service doesn't fall on the sermon. So in that sense, if I'm celebrating communion, then I can feel happy about investing strongly in an Old Testament passage for most of the sermon. Just going back to the screen share, if I can, just a couple of things on all of this. Let me get rid of those floating controls. By the way, these slides I will email to you in a PDF version, so you can don't feel you've got to scribble stuff that's on them. I'll get them to you. Here's Catherine Dell. I've got you quotations from a few people today who are all kind of Old Testament scholars and also very committed Christian preachers. So we started Walter Brueggemann, Here's Catherine Dell, who's currently at Cambridge. She talks about the Bible as at all stages a revelation about relationship, God's relationship with the world, with humankind, and with the wider creation as well, with animals. That's a quotation in the middle of a sentence of hers. Then she goes on to say, the Old Testament is a complicated set of texts, varied, contradictory, but above all, reflecting life in all its messiness. It can be our friend, even if a rather challenging and contrary one at the end of the day. It's that last phrase I like, it can be our friend. I know Bishop Pete likes to talk about the scripture as being our friend, and he's certainly an Old Testament lover. A friend can be challenging, can be contrary, can be a bit baffling, but can also be wonderfully enriching and supportive. You think of all the dimensions of friendship. And I think for me, that's a nice way to see the Old Testament. John Golding Gay wrote a book. He got so tired when teaching students, teaching the Old Testament students in sort of seminaries and theological colleges, tired of them sort of asking him, do we really need the Old Testament? Well, can't we just do with the New Testament? He wrote a rather tongue-in-cheek book called Do We Need the New Testament? And he didn't really mean it seriously. He's a committed Christian preacher. But he says, yes, of course, we need the New Testament scriptures, but they don't supersede the earlier ones. We need the First Testament. That's his preferred phrase for the Old Testament. We need the First Testament for an understanding of the story of God's working out his purpose, for its theology, for its spirituality, for its hope, for its understanding of mission, for its understanding of salvation, and for its ethics. Yeah, he gives us a bit more, but I'll leave you. You can read the further bit later if you would like to. I'm going to roll on and do a bit on that handout that I sent you, or Susanna sent you, which hopefully you've got sight of. People got that, should have come with the email from Susanna. I'm just going to sort of skim through that. I think it will contain stuff which is familiar, some of it quite familiar, others things you maybe once knew and forgot, and maybe a few things that are new. This is general stuff about the prophets and prophecy. And then after that, I've got a few slides about how does this affect preaching. So we'll just roll through this and see how we get on, if that's okay. Can everybody see? Yeah, no, it's not on the screen. It should be on your desk or your own screen. If everyone can see a copy of the handout, then we'll have a look at some of the bits there, and you can hopefully visit some of the details another time. It's loaded with references. Who were the prophets? Who's the first person described as a prophet? It's quite interesting. It's actually Abraham. Is described in those terms in Genesis and in one of the Psalms. And then Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, the siblings. Moses is kind of the ultimate everything in Old Testament thinking, and including the ultimate prophet. So he gets framed in that language. So does his brother Aaron, and so does his sister Miriam when she leads the singing and dancing after the crossing of the sea. She's described there as a prophet. And then the historical books, we call them historical books. In the Hebrew Bible, they call them the former prophets, the books of Samuel and Kings. Hebrew Bible, former prophets, because this is where prophets first really show up in a big way. So Samuel's described as a prophet, then Nathan, King David's advisor. Elijah and Elisha, of course, are very colourful characters. And then Isaiah, we see him a bit in the book of Kings, as well as, of course, in his own book. And then women prophets, we've mentioned Miriam. There's also Deborah, one of the judges, but she's described as a prophet. There's Huldah. I don't know if you've spotted Huldah on your travels in the Old Testament. She's a very interesting character. When they find a copy of the Book of the Law, which seems to be something like an early copy of Deuteronomy, in the kind of ruined and neglected temple after a particularly bad king's reign, and the king and his advisors all get in a fluster, all these blokes, and don't quite know what to do with it. So they send off to Huldah, who is a prophet and she sort of sorts them out and gives them advice of what this means. It's quite stern, serious advice of God's judgment because of the nation's disobedience. So Huldah's mentioned, and then Hodiah is mentioned in Nehemiah as a prophet opposed to him. So clearly, women as well as men were involved in this ministry. When they consult Huldah, there's nothing in the text to suggest this was odd or unusual. It was just the thing they did. So obviously, women had this gift as well as men. Even though the bulk of the characters we meet in Scripture as prophets are men. What do prophets do? They hear God's voice. The word of the Yahweh became actively present to Jeremiah or whoever it was. They see things. They see the truth. They're sometimes called seers. That can mean dreams and visions. Those come up in a number of places. And of course, they speak the message. Oracles from God, words from God, usually recorded in poetic form. Sometimes something like a parable or a story and allegory. Isaiah's song of the vineyard. Nathan's story by which he catches King David in his murder of Uriah and taking of Bathsheba, the story about the man taking someone else's lamb. Sometimes acted oracles. So Isaiah, we're told in his book, walked naked and barefoot. Jeremiah smashes a pot, a very dramatic gesture. There's Ahijah who tears a coat into 12 pieces, symbolizing the tearing apart of the kingdom. And Ezekiel does all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. He's a very dramatic kind of prophet. So the message is sometimes in words, but sometimes in actions or a combination of the two. Past, present, and future. We tend to think of prophets in terms of the future, predicting the future or promises of the future. They actually particularly speak to the present. They always proclaim God's words to their own people, their contemporaries. This is what Yahweh says to you now, you people of Judah or Jerusalem, whatever. And that message is not really an original one. It's really reminding them what they should know already. The covenants given at Mount Sinai and the responsibilities on both sides that God has committed to them and that they've committed to God, and that both sides have made these commitments and they're not keeping their side of it. That's what particularly comes out from the prophetic messages. And they use the name Lord in our Bibles, capital letters Lord. Behind that, of course, is Yahweh, the name of the covenant-making God. That's the distinctive name of Israel's God, the covenant-making God. So God's words to their contemporaries, they're always doing that. And then sometimes they're also predicting the future. And it may well be a future that's coming soon in terms of God's judgment. So judgment or wrath is coming, therefore seek God's mercy now. Or else they may say God's grace is coming, therefore walk in the light now. And what is this future? Sometimes it's the immediate future. So before the exile, people like Hosea and Micah emphasize God's coming judgment. And of course, that's fulfilled when the Assyrians march in and demolish the northern kingdom, and later the Babylonians demolish the southern kingdom. And then later prophets such as Ezekiel and the second part of Isaiah, they're also looking to a near future. God's challenge and comfort to those exiles, saying that God will restore them to their land. And so, of course, for us, those futures are now in our past. Those things have long since happened in our time frame. And then a few of the predictions look to a more distant future. There are glimpses of a royal figure who will come and save the people. And of course, as Christians, we see this fulfilled above all in Jesus. There's glimpses of a perfect age of justice and peace. And we see this again, beginning with the first coming of Jesus, but not fully experienced until his second coming. And so these different horizons, different perspectives, is what sometimes makes prophecy tricky, especially the future-looking stuff, because sometimes they blur together. My sort of illustration for this is my glass of water. I can see, if I hold this up, I can see in front of me this glass of water. It's quite near to me, quite close. But then I can also see on the screen there, I can see Chris Herbert, and I can see Roe and one or two other faces. They're slightly bent out of shape. They look rather odd. But they are definitely recognizable. It's definitely you. So I can see you and you're further away from me. And actually also, if I keep looking at this glass, I can see through the window behind my laptop and the street outside and the snow that's melting and the street lights. So somehow I'm actually able to see three different horizons at the same moment. And that's kind of what you find in the prophets. Excuse me. So, of course, separating, disentangling those horizons is part of the challenge for us as we read them. So Isaiah gives glimpses of an earthly ideal ruler, a king full of God's righteousness and judgment. And that's a challenge for the kings in his day. This is what kings are supposed to look like. But also it kind of gives us glimpses of a future greater king, which as Christians, we see this fulfilled in the person of Jesus. Prophets don't all give the same message. That's another slightly intriguing thing. So Isaiah of Jerusalem, first part of Isaiah, tells the people of Judah, don't think God has abandoned you. He will not let Jerusalem be captured. Jeremiah tells the people of Judah, don't think God always favors you. He will let Jerusalem be captured. So you've got actually opposite messages. Now Isaiah is speaking in the 8th century when the people are afraid of the Assyrian invaders. Jeremiah is speaking 100 more years later, when the people don't seem to be too bothered or afraid about anything. Perhaps because they remember how God bailed them out in Isaiah's time and saved the city, so they think, oh, okay, well, that's what God does. That's his job. We'll be fine. So that's slightly intriguing. They're covering different centuries, different periods of time, and not always the same message. And also their predictions are not always fulfilled. This is quite interesting. Jonah stands up when he finally gets to Nineveh by a rather roundabout aquatic route. He finally stands up and preaches in Nineveh and says, Nineveh will be destroyed. But it doesn't happen because the people there repent from the king down to right through the society. And so the response affects the outcome, and therefore it doesn't happen. And so that, again, we have to get the measure of. It's a bit like you say to your child who is constantly working on their computer game and out with their friends, not doing any homework, you say, you will fail your exams. You're not wanting that to come true. You're giving a warning. And actually, if they do shape up and get down to some revision and stuff, then actually it won't come true. It won't happen. So it can be that kind of language. It's provisional on what is the response of the hearer. And then a few things on interpreting prophecy. Think about what form it is. Is this a lawsuit? Are we in the law court with God as prosecutor and also God as judge? Is it a woe oracle? God predicting and explaining disaster that will come upon the people in the future? Or is it a promise? God promising salvation and a change and a blessing in the future? Is it a story, a parable, an allegory? Is it an acted oracle like we saw earlier? What kind of form of communication is it? look out for things still relevant today. The need for both right belief and right action. Both of those two are wanted. Renewing relationship with God. God's concern in the prophet's day about justice and doing right and turning from greed and idolatry. You find that all through the prophets, and the New Testament, of course, underlines those things. Those are essential for Jesus' followers too. Justice and doing right, turning from greed and idolatry. The Gospels and the letters flag those up strongly as well. So clearly those prophetic challenges are relevant to our situation in the New Testament times. And then lastly, poetry. Much of the prophets is written in poetry, although of course some bits are prose. What goes on in poetry? Highly stylized form of language. Hebrew poetry has particular things, conciseness, very few words, short clauses, not full sentences. So, start of Isaiah, it says, when you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Your hands are full of blood. So what's this about? It provokes questions. What is this blood? Whose blood? Presumably it's the blood of sacrifices. These are devout religious people who are doing the right things in terms of expected worship. They're bringing the offerings and the sacrifices. And yet the verses that follow show that neglect and oppression of the vulnerable is also happening. And so you've blood on their hands, as it were, in terms of the poor and the vulnerable. So conciseness like that, reflect on it, read it more slowly, meditate on the phrases. Parallelism, often 2 lines, sometimes more than 2 lines, but often 2 lines. The second line develops further what was in the first line. So it can be what we call synonymous parallelism, saying the same thing, but sharpening it, reinforcing it. So your sins are like scarlet, they'll be as white as snow. Though they're red as crimson, they'll be like wool. So very much the same image, but just being amplified and sharpened. Or else the second line may be different, giving a contrast, what we call antithetical parallelism. Isaiah 40, the grass withers, the flowers fall, but key word meaning contrast, but the word of our God stands forever. So the second line there is completely contrasted to the first line. So looking out for those lines and thinking about what's the connection between the 2 lines. Imagery, vivid word pictures. The prophets love doing this kind of stuff. God's people as a vine. Behold, the nations are like a drop in a bucket, like dust on the scales, Isaiah says. Vivid images that provoke our imagination and also our emotion. The leaders of Jerusalem are called leaders of Sodom and Gomorrah, reminding them of those earlier sinful cities. So imagery, not literal, but instead let it stimulate our imagination and our emotions. And the last thing in poetry is meter, a certain number of sounds or maybe ideas used in each line. Hebrew poetry seems to have something, but nobody can really agree on how it works and what it is. So it's not worth spending a lot of time on that one. So there's just a zip through that handout, fairly brief, because I say some of that I'm hoping is familiar to you. But let's have a pause there. Any comments, questions, things you want to clarify from that? If you raise a digital hand, that will help, because I say I can't see everybody who's on the screen. But anything in that you want to clarify, talk about further? No? Okay. Well, if that's right, then I'll roll on a bit with some more input. This one will be in the form of slides, and then we'll look at some readings from the lectionary. Of course, you don't have to follow the lectionary. The other option is you could do a sermon series on the prophets, particularly in the time between Pentecost and Advent. We have considerable freedom, so you might want to consider, as a church, running a series on one of the prophets or on a number of the prophets. What the lectionary does, it gives us a succession of dipping into the prophets. I think actually between now and Lent we get bits of Isaiah. In Holy Week we get the servant songs from Isaiah, and then after Pentecost we get glimpses of Elijah and Elisha in Kings, and then on into the prophetic books. But let me go back to the slides in that case. John Hosker, you've got a question, I think, have you?
No, sorry, that was a mistake, Bill. Carry on, please.
Okay, that's all right. No problem. Yeah, okay. Let me go back to my screen share, and we'll just look a bit more at the specifics of how might this play out for us as preachers. Get rid of my meeting controls. There they go. Yeah, how might this play out in preaching? There's a bit more of Golden Gate. You can see that in due course. Working through the handout, we've done that. There's the Dead Sea Scrolls, the great Isaiah scroll they found at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the most perfect that we have, a complete manuscript of all 66 chapters of Isaiah. It's a magnificent thing in the main museum in Jerusalem. Suggestions for preaching. How does this stuff impact us as preachers? And I'm borrowing ideas here from Alison Lowe, Chris Wright, and Hugh Williamson in particular. So context, what is this particular prophetic book about? If we find ourselves preaching on say, Hosea or Amos or Isaiah, whatever it is, there's Isaiah on the Sistine Chapel, as Michelangelo pictured him. I'm not sure it's quite the way I'd see Isaiah. He looks like a slightly bored-looking Roman emperor to me, but anyway, that's a matter of personal preference. What is this particular prophetic book about? What do we know about what was going on at the time? The history side of it. Were we before the exile, after the exile? And can you briefly summarize this in a sermon? I think it's important to flag this up, but not to overload your sermon with a history lesson, which then doesn't get on to actually what's this prophet saying to us. But I think something about this book and what's going on at the time is helpful. So, of course, we've got more sense for some than others in terms of the timing of it all. But in broad terms, you've got the monarchy leading up to the disaster of being overrun, destroyed, and taken to exile, and then leading on in turn to the return from exile. And a lot of our prophetic books are in that earlier period before the exile. I haven't listed them all there. I haven't got enough screen space. But that's where a lot of the stuff is. Then the exile itself, I mean, Jeremiah straddles the two. He's largely in the lead up to the exile, but also in the first period of the exile, he's in Jerusalem. And then eventually when Jerusalem gets hammered, they drag him off down to Egypt. Those of us who run away from Jerusalem, those of them who flee. So Jeremiah straddles the two. Isaiah also, of course, the second half of Isaiah is much more speaking to those in exile and giving comfort and promise of a better future, whereas the first half was much more warning of what will happen, the impending danger of God's judgment, which comes before the exile. And then the return from exile, the three, particularly the last three in our Bibles, Haggai, Zechariah and Malachi. And then others that are hard to date. I mean, Daniel is a story set in the exile, but that doesn't mean it was written during the exile. And many people feel it was written a fair while later because it seems to allude to events that come sometime later. Jonah and Joel, great books, and hard to pin down quite where they fit. So some of this stuff is more elusive, and I certainly wouldn't give a lot of sermon time to it, but I think something about this in the sermon can be really helpful as a sort of foundation stuff. The medium, how's it being communicated? If it's poetry, maybe I can take one line from it to illustrate how poetry works, maybe an example of imagery or an example of the parallelism thing. Maybe I can just take one important part of the passage to flag that up for people. And if it's a particular form, say it's a parable or it's a lawsuit or an oracle of woe, then I think explaining that briefly can be helpful. But again, that doesn't want to be a major thing. What about the message? Does this prophetic book have a repeated or central message? And if so, can we hear that in today's passage? So in Isaiah, there's a repeated phrase throughout the book of Isaiah, the Holy One of Israel, which is a great, rich phrase, and it comes all the way through the book. So quite when the book was stitched together and what was written when is still full of debate, but there's unifying things like this phrase, the Holy One of Israel. So you could do a whole sermon on that, really. God is holy. What does that mean? God is one, not multiple gods like the world of that day thought. Of Israel, committed to Israel in this covenant relationship, but not Israel's property, not the sort of genie in the lamp they bring out when they're in trouble and they control and manipulate. God is much more big and free than that. So Holy One of Israel could be a whole sermon, I think. Hosea, the exclusive relationship of the covenant is a big thing in Hosea, and it's pictured, of course, in terms of marriage, faithful or unfaithful marriage. That's the powerful imagery in Hosea, and it's the theme that dominates the book. Some of the other sort of smaller prophetic books, the day of the Lord, the day when God intervenes powerfully and judges and saves, is a recurring theme. So people need to repent or else face judgment, and yet salvation is possible. What does this book say about God's justice and God's grace? Because both those two are invariably there, justice and grace. What's the central message of this passage that I'm preaching on? Is it primarily aiming to disturb the comfortable or to comfort the disturbed? Because, again, those seem to be the two big things that the prophets do. And so, yes, Hugh Williamson points out that the book of Isaiah, the first half, really, 1 to 39, there's a lot more of disturbing the comfortable, trying to shake people out of their complacency, their blindness, their indifference, and get them to face up to the demands of God's covenant holiness. Whereas the second half, chapter 40 onwards, there's a lot more about of comfort to those who are shattered and broken in exile, and need reminders of God's gracious action and sovereignty. So in the first part of Isaiah, you get the phrase justice and righteousness a lot, emphasis on justice. The second half, you get the phrase righteousness and salvation a lot. So God demands justice. God also does salvation, does the surprising thing that we can't do of saving ourselves. So if you get a passage from Isaiah that's full of the disturbing the comfortable, then you may want just to weave in a reminder that also in Isaiah later, there's things of comfort for the disturbed. Or if you're preaching on the comfort for the disturbed, those lovely passages in the second half, then so that it isn't just cheap grace, we want to remind people there's also this challenge to holiness. The response to God's grace is compassion and justice. That's what we're called to do and to live in response to it. So if you're preaching on a passage that is one of those things more strongly, you might just want to flag up the other one that comes elsewhere in the book, just to get a good balance, really, in the message. Because of course, people may not hear a series of sermons; they may only hear this particular one. Explore more. What does this passage reveal about the character of God? I think that's a great one. What is God like? What does God think? And also, what does God feel? I think the prophets give us a lot more about God's feelings than we find in other books. We sense God's longing, God's anger, delights, joy, frustration, sometimes woven in with the messenger, the prophet. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet who sometimes you can't tell whether his agonized words are God's words or his words. The two are kind of blurred together. So something about feelings, and preaching around feelings, that God has feelings, and how do we handle our own beings as human beings? How do we handle those rightly? And what is God most concerned about, most strongly concerned about? And so we come back to the things of justice and mercy, I think, particularly there. Relationships between humans and God, humans and each other, wider creation. Look at what goes on there. What kind of community does this passage urge its readers to become? How can we embody that in our church, in our locality, in our nation? I mean, these are quite generic questions that actually could apply to other passages in both the Old and the New Testament. So I think you can find these questions useful, not just in the prophets, but I think particularly in these books. And then looking for comparisons. Are there contemporary situations and issues which seem genuinely comparable to those addressed in the text? And of course, that's the slippery phrase, genuinely comparable. How do we tease that out? What is a genuine comparison in terms of their day and our day? In what ways are they similar? And in what ways are they different? There's a whole world of stuff there, but finding something that connects with our culture. And it might well be in those big issues of idolatry, of injustice, of compassion, of grace that we've flagged up already. Just lastly, the jump to Jesus. Chris Wright is an interesting character. He urges us to resist the jump to Jesus, as he calls it. That we may instinctively feel more comfortable looking to Jesus, and so we immediately look for something that sends us to the New Testament, and then spend most of our sermon talking about that and Jesus in the New Testament, because we feel more secure and comfortable there. And I mean, Chris himself is very much a Christian preacher. He's succeeded John Stott in heading up the Langham Partnership. He's a full-blown, evangelist and all the rest, but also an Old Testament scholar. So he's not saying avoid Jesus, but still he's saying resist the urge to jump to Jesus, but just dwell in the Old Testament passage and see what it's saying. It may have these multiple horizons, multiple fulfillments, as we've seen. Some parts of it fulfilled in the prophet's day, some parts later, some parts in our own day, or even beyond our day at the final end of all things. This journey of God's people, the Old Testament, the journey that pointed and leads to Jesus. But this is the prequel, the previous stage of that journey. And an example of that would be the servant passages in Isaiah 40. This mysterious figure of the servant who emerges there in chapters 42 and 49, 50, and then 52. This figure who brings justice for the nations and a word that sustains the weary. And then in 52 and 53, this mysterious self-giving love of self-sacrifice that brings forgiveness and freedom. And so the temptation is just to think, well, that's Jesus. Jesus does all that, which, of course, as Christians, we see that. We see Jesus fulfilling this role perfectly. But when you read Isaiah, initially, he's talking about Israel. This is a role for Israel, my servant Israel. The people are called to this role. And then they fail to fulfill it. So then Jesus comes and as the perfect Israel, the figure of Israel, he fulfills it, inhabits the role perfectly. But then Jesus goes on to create and send out his people, grafted onto Israel, the church living out God's ways and message. So then suddenly this servant role becomes our role too. We are to seek for justice, to sustain the weary, to find this self-giving love. So Hugh Williamson puts it this way: to hear these passages read in Advent or Holy Week is not to encourage a smug feeling of all that has been taken care of by Christ, but rather that as imitators of Christ, we are challenged to implement these same costly and tiring values in our own changed circumstances. So the point is, if we just do the jump to Jesus, then we may think, well, okay, Jesus has done all this stuff of bringing justice, of sustaining the weary, bringing freedom through his death. So we just sit back, maybe we sing another praise song, but that's all we do. Whereas if we see this servant thing as a role for God's people, a calling for God's people, then it's calling us to, in some measure, we can never inhabit as fully as Jesus, of course, but calling us to also bring these values, these attributes into our lives and our ministry. So just resisting the urge to jump Jesus too quickly, I think, is what we can learn from that from Chris Wright. I think we're almost at the break. Oh, yes, just a reminder, of course, if you're looking for New Testament fulfillments, don't just look for Jesus, you'll also find the Father and the Spirit of God. They feature a lot in the Old Testament, in the prophets in particular. So there's some references there, as well as the coming Messianic King, whom we see as Jesus himself. So there's a lot there that leads on to Jesus, and you might like to explore some of those in due course.